They say there are simple gestures that change entire destinies. Sometimes what seems like just an offered glass of water, an open door, or a piece of bread is actually the starting point of a miracle. There is something profoundly divine in the act of caring, especially when there is no audience, when no one is watching, when the heart acts solely because it is moved by love and faith. It was so with Abraham, an elderly man living in tents in the heat of the desert, who, upon seeing 3 travelers approaching, quickly rose to greet them. He didn't know who they were. He didn't know what they brought, but without hesitation, he ran to meet them, prepared food, fetched water, and bowed before strangers as if they were sent by God himself. That scene, so common to human eyes, hid an eternal mystery. Abraham's hospitality was not just a polite gesture. It was a reflection of the heart of someone who understands that serving others is a way of serving the Lord himself. And it was in this silent, almost unnoticed act that heaven moved. The promise that seemed forgotten began to blossom again. The impossible approached the tent of a man who believed that each visitor could be a touch from God in disguise. And perhaps if we look closely, even today, the same God continues to appear in disguise on the roads of life, in the people who cross our path, in unexpected requests for help, in opportunities to be kind amidst the rush of the world. But what if what you do in silence is precisely what defines the course of what God will do in your story? What if, as you serve, God is writing the most beautiful part of your miracle, the one that still seems distant, impossible, postponed? Abraham didn't know it, but the act of serving those 3 men would be the gateway between promise and fulfillment. As he offered food and rest, the entire heavens moved toward him. Imagine the scene: the patriarch, sweaty and in a hurry, asking Sarah to prepare bread, ordering the servant to choose the best calf, rushing back and forth, unaware that he was preparing a banquet for God himself. Those 3 travelers were the Lord and 2 angels, and it was there, amid bowls of flour and the warmth of the tent, that the promise was reaffirmed. In a year's time, Sarah will have a son. The impossible was being conceived in the ordinary. The eternal manifested itself in the everyday. The invisible took shape among dishes and gestures of care. And here is the point that captures and challenges us. How many times do we fail to experience miracles because we think that God's move only happens in the temple, in prayer, or at the altar? And we forget that he also reveals himself in service, at the table, in listening, in silent help. There is something profoundly divine about serving. Service, when born from a heart aligned with God, becomes a bridge between heaven and earth. And this is precisely what we see in the story of Abraham in Genesis 18. He wasn't at an altar, nor at a grand moment of worship. He was sitting at the tent door in the heat of the day when he saw 3 men approaching. Unaware of their presence, he quickly got up, ran toward them, and bowed in respect. In that simple act, offering water, bread, and rest, there was a reflection of God's own character, a heart willing to welcome, care, and serve. The patriarch didn't wait for recognition, didn't seek honor, didn't calculate what he would gain. He simply served. And it was in this movement of humility and readiness that the dormant promise was awakened. This is how God works. He manifests himself in the ordinary, transforms the everyday into an altar, and makes the simplest gesture the setting for an eternal miracle. Today, many live in search of grand revelations, extraordinary signs, and overwhelming experiences, but they forget that service comes before the supernatural. The same God who visited Abraham in the heat of the day continues to visit willing hearts in the heat of daily tasks. Perhaps you too have long-held promises, dreams that seem to have aged, hopes hidden in silence, and perhaps the path to seeing the impossible come true isn't chasing answers, but serving. Serving even when you don't understand. Serving even when you're tired. Serving even when it seems like nothing is changing. It is in service that faith matures. It is in service that the heart aligns with God's will. It is in service that the impossible becomes possible. The essence of this story lies in a simple yet powerful truth. Those who care for others are cared for by God. Abraham didn't serve expecting a reward. He didn't know he was standing before the Lord himself, accompanied by angels. He simply acted out of a generous and sensitive heart. While many wait for God to come first and then act, Abraham did the opposite. He acted, and then God came. This is a spiritual key that changes everything. When we move out of love, without self-interest, heaven moves for us. Abraham prepared water to wash the travelers' feet, asked Sarah to bake fresh bread, and chose the best calf to offer them food. He cared for the comfort of strangers, never imagining that this very concern would be the channel of a miracle. Because it was there in the shade of the tent, among bread, water, and rest, that God remembered his promise. In a year's time, Sarah, your wife, will have a son. The promise that seemed forgotten was rekindled in the service environment. It is as if the Lord were saying, Abraham, while you take care of whom I send, I will take care of what you hope for. This is the message that transcends time and reaches us today. Serving isn't wasting time, it's investing in eternity. Every act of kindness, every act of care, every moment you choose to love instead of shutting yourself down, all of this builds an invisible altar where God manifests. And perhaps what you have been praying for so long will not come when you are seeking, but when you are serving. Back then, the desert was an unforgiving place. The sun beat down mercilessly, and the dust seemed to mix with the traveler's very breath. Having an open tent and fresh water was more than a gesture of kindness. It was an act of survival. It was culture and also faith. Abraham lived in Mamre, a high place surrounded by oak trees, a stopping point for those crossing those arid lands. He had no walls, no locked gates, but an open tent, and that said everything about his heart. He was a man of service. The ancient patriarchs knew that welcoming someone was like opening space for God to act. There was a sense of reverence in welcoming. Hospitality was seen as an expression of faith, a way of recognizing that everything one possessed came from the Lord and should therefore be shared. Today, in a fast-paced and distrustful world, this lesson seems distant. We close doors, build emotional walls, and avoid engaging. We live surrounded by people, but truly isolated. However, Abraham reminds us of something essential. God visits open hearts. While many seek grandiose manifestations, Abraham received God himself in his daily routine, on an ordinary day, in the desert heat, among pots and pans and dust. The divine presence came not in the temple, but in the tent. It came not in worship, but in care. This shows that God still reveals himself in the simple, everyday, in the place where there is space for others. He doesn't need a stage, just availability. And perhaps that's why many fail to perceive God's presence today, because he continues to come disguised as need. He comes in the cry for help of a friend, in the need of a neighbor, in the silence of someone who simply needs to be heard. When you serve, when you show compassion, when you are willing, the same God who visited Abraham visits you. And it is in this encounter between human gesture and divine grace that miracles happen. Abraham sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. There was nothing special about that moment. No sign in the sky, no voice from the clouds, just the weariness of a long journey and the heat that made the air tremble over the sand. And it was in this ordinary moment that God decided to appear. 3 men approached from afar, 3 travelers, covered in dust, exhausted from the road. Abraham could have looked at them and thought, more work, more mouths to feed. But he didn't hesitate. He ran to meet them, bowed down to the ground, and invited them to rest. And this is where the text reveals something extraordinary. Even before he knew who they were, Abraham acted as if he served God himself. He asked Sarah to prepare bread, ran to the herd, and chose the best calf. He hurried, served, and cared, not out of obligation but out of love. This is the secret of hearts that attract God's presence. They don't wait to feel something before acting. They act because God's love is already within them. Abraham didn't serve because he knew who the visitors were. He served because goodness was already part of his being. And when kindness becomes a habit, the divine presence finds a home. Imagine that scene. Sarah kneading bread, the aroma of the meal wafting up, the travelers resting under the shade of the tree, and Abraham standing there, attentive, serving. So simple, so human, and yet so heavenly. He didn't know it, but he was facing a divine visit, an encounter that would change everything. That afternoon, amidst gestures of hospitality, the Eternal was testing and rewarding the heart of a faithful man. How often does God visit us like this, hidden in simplicity? In a phone call from someone who needs to talk, in a neighbor asking for help, in a child seeking attention, in the opportunity to serve unseen. It is in these moments that he observes, is this heart still generous? Is there still room for others? Is there still faith in the little things? Abraham proved that he could, and so God showed him something no one else knew, a promise that seemed impossible. As the travelers ate, Abraham watched in silence. The sun was beginning to set on the horizon, and the light wind carried the sound of flocks in the distance. It was an ordinary day, until one of the visitors looked up and asked something that seemed simple, but changed the tone of the conversation. "Where is Sarah, your wife?" Abraham's heart skipped a beat. How did the man know her name? He replied, "It's right there in the tent." Then came the sentence that cut through time like a flash. "I will return to you in a year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." For a moment the world seemed to stop. From across the tent, Sarah heard, and laughed. She laughed silently to herself, as if trying to hide a secret deep within. It wasn't a laugh of joy, but of someone who had given up on dreaming, because Sarah was barren and old, and God's promises seemed to have passed their expiration date. How often is it like this with us? God speaks and the heart laughs, not with faith but with disbelief disguised as realism, because time has passed, because the pain has grown weary, because the wait has become too long. Sarah laughed, but God heard her laughter, and he asked, "Why did Sarah laugh?" The question echoed, and the silence that followed was almost sacred. Then came the divine answer, firm and sweet at the same time. "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" At that moment, Abraham's heart sank. He knew he was facing something great. The same God who had made promises before was now reaffirming them before him and his wife, even when they no longer had the strength to believe as before. And here the real conflict arises. How can we continue to believe when faith seems old? How can we continue to hope when our bodies no longer respond, when hope no longer burns, when tears seem easier than prayer? Abraham and Sarah were facing the greatest tension of their spiritual lives, the distance between what God said and what their eyes saw. But God wasn't just testing their faith, he was teaching them the timing of the promise. Because there are promises that God plants early but reaps late, so that we learn that miracles don't depend on age, but on his faithfulness. And this is where the story shifts. Sarah's smile of disbelief would transform into a laugh of joy. But before that, there would come days of silence, nights of doubt, and unanswered steps. Perhaps you are in that same gap between what God has promised and what has not yet happened. And it is here, precisely in that space between the already and the not yet, that God works most profoundly. He was about to do something no one expected, but first he needed Abraham to maintain the heart of the same man who ran to serve travelers. The heart that serves is the same heart that receives. The days passed after that mysterious visit. Life returned to the rhythm of the desert, but Abraham and Sarah's hearts were no longer the same. They had heard the promise once again, and now the challenge was not to understand, but to wait. And waiting is one of the most silent battles the soul faces. There are no swords, no screams, no visible enemies, but there is a constant war within the heart, between what God has said and what is not yet seen. Abraham woke every morning looking at the sky. The stars that once represented the promise now seemed like distant memories. He looked at Sarah and saw the time stamped on her face, and perhaps silently prayed, "Lord, is it really? Is it still possible?" Meanwhile, Sarah wrestled with her own soul. The laughter that had once been one of disbelief now turned to shame. "Why am I laughing?" she might have wondered. "Does God still remember me?" And this is a point where many also stumble, because God promises, but doesn't explain when. He speaks, but doesn't detail the process. And in this space of waiting, the human heart tries to help the divine. Sarah remembered the past, the time when, tired of waiting, she gave her servant Hagar to Abraham. The idea seemed logical, practical, and the result was Ishmael, a son born, yes, but outside of God's perfect plan, a human attempt to speed up divine time. And now, years later, she saw the consequences of that decision, the tensions, the conflicts, the pain, all because one day he tried to help the promise. But still, God didn't give up. He didn't cancel his purpose because of their mistake. He simply waited for the moment when their hearts would be ready for the true miracle. Abraham was also fighting his own war. The same man who had once heard, "Go out of your country," and obeyed without question, now had to believe that the impossible would happen within his own household. It was easier to believe for a nation than for a barren womb, and if we're honest, it's the same for us. Sometimes it's easier to believe that God will bless the world than to believe that he will transform our story. Abraham's struggle was not against human enemies, but against doubt, time, and weariness. Sarah's struggle was not against the desert, but against memories, fear, and the weight of a promise postponed. But the desert is the field where God tests the faith he himself planted. And there, amidst tents and winds, dust and silence, heaven worked in secret. Perhaps God is also working silently in your life today. You see no signs, hear no answers, but he hasn't stopped. Heaven never forgets what it promised. And when God's promise seems to linger, it's not because he's forgotten, it's because he's preparing you to hold it when it comes. Abraham cared for the travelers, unaware that he was caring for God's own plan. Now, God cared for Abraham, preparing him for the day when Sarah's laughter would cease to be disbelief and become testimony. If this word has spoken to you, say amen in the comments. Sometimes that amen is your way of saying, "Lord, I still believe, even though I'm tired." The human heart tends to want to cooperate with God, but more often than not, it only ends up hindering what he was already silently doing. Abraham and Sarah knew what God had said, but time had become a cruel enemy. And when the wait grows longer, reasoning tries to replace faith. Sarah began to think that perhaps she had misunderstood. Perhaps God intended the promise to come in another form, by another path. Then came the idea, seemingly reasonable, but spiritually disastrous. "Take Hagar, my servant. Perhaps this is how God will fulfill his word." And Abraham, tired of waiting, accepted. How often do we do the same? We take shortcuts, not because we doubt God, but because we doubt ourselves. Because we think the Lord may have changed his mind, or that we've already missed the promised deadline. But when we try to resolve what only heaven can do, we create consequences we weren't prepared to bear. Hagar conceived, Ishmael was born, and for a time all seemed well. But as the days passed, tension grew within the tent and within the soul. Hagar looked at Sarah with contempt. Sarah looked at Abraham with guilt, and Abraham looked up to the sky, trying to understand what had gone wrong. Maybe you've been there too, where you tried to force something to work and ended up hurt in the process, where you made a decision just to avoid wasting what you thought was God's timing, only to discover that human timing isn't the same as heaven's. But here's the beauty of grace. God doesn't nullify his promise because of human error. He can redirect the path, correct the course, and still fulfill what he said, because the Lord's purpose is stronger than human failures. Years had passed since Ishmael. Abraham loved him, raised him, but there was still a place in his heart that knew this is not it yet. And when God appeared again, it was not to rebuke, but to reaffirm. Abraham, your wife Sarah will bear you a son. There is no other way, there is no other plan. God reminded us again that the true promise would come from what was impossible in human eyes. Sometimes God needs to let human attempts run their course so we can recognize that only He can fulfill what He has promised. And when we finally admit, Lord, I can't, that's when He answers, now I can act. Sarah, tired, smiled again, and heaven smiled with her, because even without realizing it, she was about to see that the God who promises is also the God who fulfills, even when everything seems too late. If this message touched your heart, write in the comments what God has taught you about waiting. Your faith can strengthen someone who is also tired of waiting. The turning point in Abraham's story didn't happen in a great battle, nor in a supernatural experience visible to all. It happened in a quiet moment beneath the trees on an ordinary day. 3 travelers approached his tent, and he, as he always did, ran to greet them. Abraham didn't know who they were. There were no signs of royalty, no celestial brilliance. They were just men weary from their journey, covered in desert dust. Still, he hurried to offer them water, rest, and food. He ordered Sarah to prepare fresh bread, ordered a calf to be roasted, and served them with the best he had. In that simple gesture, Abraham demonstrated what had always been in his heart: hospitality, care, generosity. He didn't know it, but that act of kindness would be the turning point in his life. Because while he cared for the travelers, God cared for the fulfillment of the promise. There are times when miracles hide in seemingly small actions. As Abraham served, the promise moved. As he bowed before those men, heaven bowed down to him. After the meal, one of the travelers looked at Abraham and asked, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" And when he heard the answer, he said, "In a year I will return, and she will have a son." It was as if time stood still. Those words pierced the air and touched Sarah's heart, listening behind the tent. She laughed, not in joy, but in disbelief. She laughed at the absurdity of still having hope. She laughed at the impossible. But God heard the laughter, and the laughter of doubt would be transformed into laughter of promise. "Why did Sarah laugh?" the Lord asked. "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" From that moment on, everything changed. Abraham's faith, tested so many times, was rekindled. Because when God speaks, even barrenness begins to blossom. When God promises, even the desert begins to blossom. The turning point, then, was not the birth of Isaac. It was the moment Abraham and Sarah believed again, when hope, once dormant, awoke again, when the laughter of disbelief began to transform into a smile of faith. And perhaps that's exactly what the Lord wants to do with you today. Maybe His promise seems distant. Maybe time has made you laugh at what you once believed. But God still appears in the midst of ordinary days, in the simple scenes of life, and whispers, "Is anything impossible for me?" While Abraham cared for the travelers, heaven cared for the impossible. And what seemed like a simple gesture of kindness was, in fact, the setting God chose to restart the story of a promise. If this word spoke to you, share it with someone who needs to remember that God still visits tents, still speaks on ordinary days, and still fulfills promises that time has tried to erase. The sun was setting over the hills of Mamre, tinting the sky with hues of gold and orange. And that late afternoon, Abraham gazed at the horizon with a heart filled with a mixture of awe and wonder. The travelers had already departed, but the air still carried something divine, a presence that wouldn't dissipate with the wind. He couldn't explain it, but within him was a silent certainty. God had been there. Time passed. The seasons changed. The desert, which had always seemed the same, now held a promise. And when everything seemed to follow the normal rhythm of life, when Abraham no longer counted the days or looked at the calendar of waiting, the miracle arrived. Sarah, who had once laughed at the impossible, now wept, holding the fruit of the promise in her arms. The laughter of doubt was replaced by laughter of gratitude, and that boy, born against all the laws of nature, was named Isaac, which means laughter. God had transformed the sound of disbelief into eternal joy. It was the culmination of a long story, full of ups and downs, fears and expectations. But it was also the most beautiful reminder that God fulfills his promises, even when we stop believing. Abraham looked at his son and saw more than a child. He saw God's faithfulness embodied in every detail. Each laugh of Isaac was a testament to the fact that heaven does not forget, that God's timing is perfect, and that his love always finds a way to reach us. But the climax of Abraham's faith was yet to come. Because one day, the same God who had given him the promised son asked him something no human heart could bear. Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and offer him as a burnt offering. It was as if the world had collapsed. The promise, the laughter, the joy, everything seemed about to be taken away. But Abraham, the same man who had rushed to serve the travelers, now rose early, prepared the wood, and walked in silence, trusting that the same God who promised would be the God who would provide. And on Mount Moriah, the heavens bowed down to the earth again. Abraham raised the knife, his hands trembling, his heart in tears, but his faith firm. And before the blow fell, the angel's voice echoed, "Abraham, do not harm the boy." It was at that moment that the sky revealed what he had always known. Abraham's faith was true. And when he looked up, he saw a ram caught by its horns in a thicket. God had provided. There, on top of the mountain, Abraham gave the place a name. Jehovah-Jireh, the Lord will provide. And that altar became the eternal symbol that God is never late, that he manifests himself in obedience, and that the love we give is never lost in his hands. The climax of this story is not just the birth of Isaac, nor the provision on the mountain. The true climax is the heart of a man who learned to trust, even when he didn't understand. It is the faith that remains standing, even when logic falls to its knees. It is the love that serves travelers and delivers promises, knowing that, in everything, God remains good. And perhaps you're on your own mountain right now. Perhaps God has asked you for something that seems impossible to deliver. Perhaps the altar is ready, but your heart resists. Know that, in the silence of obedience, heaven works on your behalf. God never wastes pain, never ignores faith, and never abandons those who choose to trust. The same God who provided for Abraham will provide for you. If this word touched your heart, say Amen in the comments. May your Amen be the echo of your faith, the seed of your surrender, and the beginning of your own provision. The wind blew gently atop Mount Moriah. Smoke from the altar rose slowly into the sky, a silent symbol of surrender and trust. Abraham, now at peace in his heart, descended the mountain with Isaac at his side. Each step was light, as if the weight of the impossible had been lifted. He had understood what God wanted to teach from the beginning. True faith is not believing that God will do it, but trusting even when he seems not to do it. That day, Abraham not only met the God who keeps promises, but the God who reveals himself in trials, the God who demands surrender, not to take away, but to transform, the God who tests the heart, not to wound, but to strengthen. And the boy Isaac, walking beside his father, carried with him the living memory of a love that provides, of a God who never fails. Sarah's laughter echoed in the tent. The same laughter that had once been born of doubt now blossomed into adoration. The altar on the mountain remained as an eternal testimony. God will provide. And this is the promise that spans generations, from Abraham's desert to the present day. Because all of us, at some point, will be led to our own Moriah. We will all be called to trust when we don't understand, to surrender when we want to hold on, to believe when everything seems to say no. But the same God who was there with Abraham is with you now. He remains Jehovah-Jireh, the Lord who provides, not just the ram in the thicket, but peace in the storm, strength in weakness, and hope in the midst of pain. Abraham came down from the mountain with more than just a son. He came down with a mature faith, a faith that doesn't depend on results but on relationships. He learned that God's purpose is never to destroy, but to reveal. And perhaps this is what the Lord wants to teach you today, that He is still in control, even when everything seems out of order, that He still speaks, even in the silence, that He still provides, even when time seems to have run out. Abraham's story ends with the promise confirmed, a descendant as numerous as the stars in the sky. But more than that, it ends with a man's heart transformed. Because in the end, the real miracle was not the birth of Isaac. The true miracle was Abraham's faith being reborn on the altar of surrender. So if your altar today is pain, waiting, or uncertainty, don't give up. The same God who provided on the mountaintop will also provide in the valley of your life. Believe, hope, trust. And when the miracle comes, because it will, may your laughter, like Sarah's, be the sound of God's faithfulness echoing throughout your home. Say in faith, on the mountain of the Lord, it will be provided. Genesis 22:14. And if this message reminded you that God continues to care, leave a comment saying, I trust in the Lord's provision. Perhaps these words will be a refuge for someone who is still waiting for their own miracle.